Let me tell you something before we start. I was going to be a pastor, seminary, the whole thing. Third year, I found Spinoza's banned book in the library. What I read that night, I never went back. And today I'm going to show you exactly what he discovered.
The more carefully you read the Gospels, the more clearly you see what has been removed from them. 4 women were at the Last Supper. Spinoza found the evidence. The church erased it. I realize that sounds like something you either accept or reject on the spot. But I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to read. Because the evidence does not come from some lost scroll found in a cave. It comes from the same text the church reads every Sunday morning. It is in Luke. It is in plain sight. And by the end of this, you will know not just that they were erased, but who they were. And that changes everything. Here is the paradox I want you to sit with. The Gospels follow women through the entire ministry of Jesus, from Galilee to Jerusalem. They name them. They describe what they did. They record that these women financed the operation, traveled with the group, witnessed the crucifixion, discovered the empty tomb. At every single stage of the story, from the beginning to the very end, the women are there, documented, named, present. Except at one moment, the most important moment, the Last Supper. At the one event that became the central ritual of the entire Christian tradition, the women vanish. No explanation, no farewell, no mention of departure. They are simply not there. And then, 48 hours later, they reappear at the cross, as though they had never left. That absence is too precise to be accidental. And I want to tell you exactly how Spinoza found the scene. But first, I need you to understand who these women actually were. Because the identity of one of them changes the political reading of the entire Passion narrative, and no one talks about it. Open your Bible to Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. This is Luke's own text, not a Gnostic fragment, not a disputed codex. Luke, the physician, the one the church itself considers authoritative. Luke writes that Jesus traveled through cities and villages, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Then Luke names them: Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out; Joanna, the wife of Schüssler, who was the manager of Herod's household; Susanna, and many others. Now listen to what Luke says next. These women, Luke writes, provided for them out of their own resources. The Greek verb is diekonoun, and this is where most readers move past without noticing what they have just read. Because diekonoun is not a word that means brought the food or tidied the room. It is the same verb used throughout the New Testament for ministerial service. It is the verb from which we derive the word deacon. When the early church described what Paul did, what Peter did, what the apostles did in their communities, they used this verb, diekonoun. And Luke applies it to the women without qualification, without hesitation, without any softening language that might suggest a lesser kind of service. These were not peripheral followers, watching from the back of the crowd. They were co-travelers who funded the ministry from their own money, and who performed the same functional role that Luke describes with the same Greek word he uses for the 12. I taught a New Testament seminar in Norwich some years ago, early 2000s, gray winter morning, the kind where the light through the windows never quite commits to being daylight. The radiator in the corner was ticking the way old radiators do, not warming the room so much as narrating its coldness. We were working through Luke 8. A student raised her hand and asked a question that I am still thinking about. She was in her 2nd year, good formation, earnest in the way students are before academic caution teaches them to hedge every sentence. She said, "But if they followed him all the way from Galilee, where did they go during supper?" The room went quiet. Not the quiet of boredom. The quiet of something that had been there all along and had never been asked aloud. 20 faces turned toward me, and I realized, standing there with Luke open on the desk, that in 30 years of reading this text, I had never once formulated the question that directly: where did they go? That is the first thing I want you to hold on to. The women of Luke 8 are not an afterthought. They are named, described, functionally equivalent to the apostles in Luke's own language, and they traveled with Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. Luke himself tells us this. So when they disappeared from the room in Luke 22, the question is not whether they were there. The question is, who removed them from the text? But before I show you the textual evidence, I need to address the argument you will hear from every apologist who encounters this material. The argument from custom. The claim is that in first-century Palestine, women did not eat with men in formal settings, that the Last Supper was a meal among rabbis and disciples, and that women would have been excluded by cultural convention. This is wrong. And it is wrong for a very specific reason that anyone can verify. The Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels is a Passover meal, a Seder. And the Passover Seder in the first century was not what the later rabbinic tradition turned it into. The post-70 rabbinic codification of the Seder, the one most people think of when they hear the word, developed after the destruction of the temple. Before that, the Passover was a family meal. The Mishnah Pesachim, which records practices that predate the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, explicitly includes women and children in the Passover celebration. It specifies their obligations. It describes their role. They are not permitted. They are required. This was not optional. The entire theological point of the Passover, going back to Exodus itself, is that the memory of liberation belongs to everyone. Men, women, children. All participate, all eat, all remember. The idea that Jesus, a Galilean Jew, observing Passover with his closest companions, including the women who had traveled with him from Galilee, who had funded his ministry, who are documented by Luke himself as being present in Jerusalem at that time, would have excluded them from the Seder. Violates everything we know about first-century Jewish practice. The custom argument does not hold. It collapses the moment you open the Mishnah. Now here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, and I think you should know that before I continue. Because what I'm about to show you is a contradiction inside a single gospel, not between Matthew and Luke, not between John and the Synoptics. Inside one author, inside one narrative voice. And when a text contradicts itself from within, SPINOZA says, look at the seam, because the seam is where the editor's hand becomes visible. Turn to Luke, chapter 23, verse 49. This is after the crucifixion. Luke writes, and all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Read that sentence again. The women who had followed him from Galilee. These are the women of Luke 8, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, the many others. Luke identifies them by the same phrase he used earlier, the women from Galilee. They are at the cross. But here is the problem. Between Luke 8 and Luke 23, there is Luke 22, the Last Supper. And in Luke 22, these women do not appear. They are not mentioned as present. They are not mentioned as absent. They are not mentioned at all. And yet Luke 23 brings them back, as though they had never left. The women who had followed him from Galilee. The grammar does not forget, even when the editor does. I was at a conference in the north of England, mid-90s, one of those New Testament studies events that blur together after a few decades, thin plastic cups of institutional tea that was always the wrong temperature. Between sessions, I caught a specialist in Lucan texts in the corridor. She was carrying a stack of folders and looked as though she had somewhere to be. I mentioned the contradiction between Luke 22 and Luke 23:49. She stopped, set her folders on the narrow windowsill beside her, looked at me, and said something I have carried with me ever since. The grammar does not forget, even when the editor does. Then she picked up her folders and kept walking. I stood in that corridor for a long time. The strip light above me was humming at that frequency that makes you feel slightly outside of the moment you are standing in, because the precision of what she had said was the precision of the problem itself. Luke could not erase the women entirely from chapter 23, because he had already written them into chapter 8. The same author, the same narrative, the same women, and the gap between chapter 8 and chapter 23 is not a gap of ignorance. It is a gap of editorial decision. Someone chose to leave them out of that room, and the text could not fully absorb the choice. This is the method SPINOZA articulated in the Tractatus. When two passages by the same author create a contradiction, the contradiction is not a mistake. It is evidence. It is the signature of an editorial layer imposed on a narrative that, in its original form, told a different story. The text cannot say what it wants to say without revealing what it was forced to remove. The same author who wrote Luke 22 wrote Luke 23:49. He could not erase the women entirely because he had already written them in. And there is one more textual detail that most readers overlook. Luke 22, verses 11 and 12. Jesus sends two disciples to prepare the Passover meal. He tells them, "When you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters." A man carrying a jar of water. In first-century Palestine, carrying water was overwhelmingly a task performed by women. A man carrying a jar of water would have been conspicuous, noticeable, worth mentioning precisely because it was unusual. The fact that the text specifies this detail implies something about the household they were entering. It was a household where women were present and active. The supper took place in someone's home. Women were in that home. Luke tells us this indirectly through the water carrier, while simultaneously erasing them from the table. The seam is visible. It has always been visible. Now I need to tell you about the scholarship, because what I am describing is not speculation. It has a name, it has a history, and the person who articulated it most clearly was Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, who held the Christa Stendahl Chair at Harvard Divinity School. In 1983, Schüssler Fiorenza published a book called In Memory of Her. The title comes from Mark chapter 14, verse 9. An unnamed woman anoints Jesus at Bethany before his arrest. Jesus says, "Wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." That is a direct promise from Jesus that this woman's act would be remembered universally, forever. It was not. Most Christians have never heard her name. Most cannot identify the passage. The promise was made, and then the tradition did precisely what it claimed it would never do. It forgot. That is not a failure of memory. That is a program of forgetting. Schüssler Fiorenza demonstrated, with rigorous textual analysis, that the process of erasing women from early Christian leadership did not begin after the New Testament was written. It began within the New Testament itself. The editing is internal. Luke knows that the women of chapter 8 meet every criterion for apostleship that Acts would later define. They accompanied Jesus from Galilee. They witnessed his death. They were present at the resurrection. Every condition. And yet Luke does not call them apostles. Dorothy A. Lee, a New Testament scholar, who has written extensively on the Lucan narrative, puts it simply. Luke knows. Luke knows the women qualify, and Luke chooses not to say so. The silence is not accidental, it is architectural. The verb diekonoun in Luke 8:3. When it was translated into Latin, then into English, it became ministered unto, or provided for, or served. Each translation a slight reduction, each reduction a small erasure, until the word that originally carried the full weight of ministerial leadership became a word that suggested domestic service. The meaning did not erode naturally. It was guided, step by step, century by century. There are 4 names. The Church left traces of all 4. Here is what each one means. Mary Magdalene, the most prominent, named first in nearly every list, present at the crucifixion in all 4 Gospels, present at the empty tomb, the first witness of the resurrection in John's account, a woman whose centrality to the Jesus movement is attested by more sources than most of the male apostles. She financed the ministry. She was there at the end. If the Last Supper happened, and Mary Magdalene was in Jerusalem with Jesus, the idea that she was not in the room requires an explanation that the text does not provide. Joanna, this is the name that makes this dangerous, not Mary Magdalene, Joanna, because Joanna was married to Chusa, and Chusa was the household manager of Herod Antipas. This is not a peripheral figure. Chusa ran the domestic administration of the Tetrarch's palace, which means Joanna had access. Access to the palace, access to information, access to the political machinery that was, at that very moment, conspiring with the temple authorities to arrest and execute Jesus. Think about what that means. If Joanna was present at the Last Supper, then a woman with direct connections to Herod's administration was in the room when Jesus spoke of his imminent betrayal. She may have known. She may have had intelligence. She may have been the reason Jesus knew what was coming. The implications have never been fully examined by mainstream scholarship because examining them requires acknowledging that she was there. The erasure of Joanna is not the same kind of erasure as the erasure of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was erased to protect male apostolic authority. Joanna was erased because her presence raises questions about political knowledge that the institutional narrative cannot accommodate. Who knew what was going to happen? Who had access to Herod's plans? And what did that access mean for the events of that night? Susanna, named once, Luke 8, verse 3, and then never again. One mention, one name. Enough for Luke to record, but not enough for the tradition to preserve. She appears and vanishes in a single verse, and the brevity of her mention is itself a form of erasure. Luke names her because she was important enough to name. The tradition forgot her because forgetting was easier than explaining. We do not know what she did, what she said, what she witnessed. We only know that she was there, and then she was not. And the gap between those two facts is the gap where her story used to be. And then Luke writes, and many others, the unnamed, the collective, the women whose presence was so extensive that Luke cannot avoid acknowledging it but will not specify it. Many others. How many? We do not know, because the text that would have told us was edited by the same hands that removed them from the supper. I was standing in front of a reproduction of Leonardo's Last Supper some years ago. Large, well lit. One of those prints you see in conference halls or in the corridors of theology departments. The kind of reproduction that has been looked at so many times by so many people that it has acquired a kind of authority that the paint on the wall in Milan no longer fully possesses. And I realized something that I found genuinely unsettling. The image had become more real to me than the text. When I closed my eyes and thought of the Last Supper, I did not see Luke 22. I saw Leonardo. 13 men at a long table. No women, no children, no family seder. Just 13 men in a Renaissance Italian room with Roman architectural details and tablecloths that did not exist in first century Palestine. The light falling from the left in a way that owes more to 15th century Milanese studios than to any room in Jerusalem. I had read the passage dozens of times, and still when I closed my eyes I saw Da Vinci's room. That is what consolidation looks like. That is what happens when an image replaces a text in the cultural memory and nobody notices the substitution. Leonardo painted the Last Supper between 1495 and 1497. By then, the erasure was already 1500 years old. The painting did not create the erasure. The painting made the erasure permanent. It gave it a face, it gave it a room. It gave it a composition so powerful that it overwrote the text it claimed to illustrate. The mechanism of this suppression was not a single act. It was a process that unfolded across centuries, each stage building on the silence of the one before. In the first century, the Gospels were written. The women were present in the narrative, but already being edited at the margins. The verb was softened, the names were retained, but the roles were diminished. In the 4th century, the councils consolidated male ecclesiastical authority. The Council of Laodicea in the 360s prohibited women from serving as presbyters. The later councils reinforced this prohibition. The exegetical tradition that developed alongside these councils read the Last Supper as the institution of the priesthood, and the priesthood was male. If the Last Supper was the origin of the sacrament, and the sacrament required male ministers, then the room had to contain only men. The theology demanded it, and the text was read accordingly. In the 15th century, Leonardo fixed the image. 13 men, no women. And from that point forward, the erasure was not just textual, it was visual, it was cultural. It was the only version of the event that most people would ever encounter. The question is not whether the church knew the women were there. The question is what it would have meant if they admitted it. Because admitting it would have meant that the foundational moment of the sacrament included women as full participants. It would have meant that the first Eucharist was not an all-male ordination ceremony, but a Passover Seder, with women as Jewish law required. It would have meant that the institutional exclusion of women from the priesthood rested not on the original event, but on the edited version of the original event. And that distinction is not small. That distinction is the distance between a foundation and a fabrication. And Joanna. If Joanna was at the table, it would have meant that someone with political intelligence from Herod's own household was present when Jesus spoke of betrayal. It would have opened questions about foreknowledge, about information networks, about the possibility that the arrest was not a surprise to everyone in the room. The institutional narrative requires that Jesus walked into his fate with 12 loyal but confused men. If Joanna was there, the story becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story in which knowledge was present, and silence about that knowledge was the first act of institutional editing. Spinoza asks a question I have been sitting with for years. Not what did they erase, but what does an institution reveal about itself by what it cannot afford to remember? The method is simple. You do not start with what the text says. You start with what the text cannot say without contradicting itself, and then you look at the shape of the silence. Because silence in a religious text is never empty. Silence is architecture. The silence about the women at the Last Supper is structured. It has edges. It has seams. It is surrounded on both sides by text that makes the silence impossible to maintain. Luke 8 names them. Luke 23 brings them back. And between those two passages, Luke 22 performs an act of removal so precise that it could only have been deliberate. When you reverse the erasure, when you read Luke as though the editorial layer were transparent, what emerges is not a scandal. It is something quieter and, I think, more important. What emerges is a figure of Jesus whose closest relationships, whose most constant companions, whose most loyal followers from the beginning to the end were women, not exclusively, but prominently, centrally, financially, ministerially. These were the people who funded him, who traveled with him, who did not flee when the men scattered, who stood at the cross when Peter was hiding, who went to the tomb when no one else dared. And that is what the institution could not accommodate. Not the presence of women in the room, the centrality of women in the story. Because if the women were central, then the tradition that excluded them was not preserving the original. It was replacing it. The church did not erase the women from the Last Supper because they were unimportant. It erased them because they were too important, because their presence in the room would have told a story that the institution from the 4th century onward could not afford to tell. A story in which the people closest to Jesus, the people who knew him best, who stayed longest, who risked the most, were the people the tradition spent 2,000 years learning to forget. Spinoza understood this. He understood that the deepest truth in a religious text is often the one the text has been edited to conceal. Not because the editors were evil, but because the institutions they served required a version of events that could sustain the structures they had built, and those structures could not include what the women in the room would have made visible. Read Luke 8, then read Luke 22, then read Luke 23:49. Read them in order, read them slowly, and ask yourself, where did they go? Because the text cannot answer that question, and that inability is the answer.
These videos take months of research. Most people who watch aren't subscribed. If this meant something to you, help me keep going. One click. That's all I'm asking.